Thomas Hale had never imagined that a single bowl of soup could become the moment that changed the course of his life. Every morning before sunrise, he woke to the sound of his 7-year-old daughter Emma humming softly in her sleep, and for a few precious seconds he forgot how difficult life had become. Then reality settled in. The tiny farmhouse they rented sat on the edge of a quiet farming town where fields stretched farther than the eye could see, but the land around them belonged to someone else. Thomas worked wherever he could, repairing fences, mending roofs, hauling hay, or loading wagons. Yet no matter how many hours he worked, there never seemed to be enough money. 3 years earlier, his wife Sarah had passed away after a sudden illness, leaving him with a grieving little girl and a mountain of unpaid medical bills. Since then, every decision he made revolved around one question. How could he make sure Emma never felt the weight of their poverty? Emma was different from most children. She never complained when dinner was only bread and potatoes. She never asked for new dresses when her old ones became too short. She always smiled as though she believed her father could solve every problem in the world. That smile became Thomas's greatest strength and his greatest fear. He was terrified of the day she might realize that he had no answers left. One cold November afternoon, Thomas finished repairing a storm-damaged barn several miles outside town. His employer apologized with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, Thomas. The bank still hasn't approved my loan. I can only pay half today." Thomas accepted the few wrinkled bills anyway. Half was better than nothing. On the walk home, he stopped at the small bakery, hoping to buy something warm for Emma. The money in his pocket was barely enough for a loaf of yesterday's bread and a small bowl of vegetable soup. He carried both carefully, imagining Emma's face lighting up. As he reached the town square, he noticed an elderly man sitting alone on a bench. His coat was torn, his hands shook from the cold, and he stared longingly at the steaming bowl Thomas carried. Thomas slowed. He looked at the soup, then at the old man, then at the bread meant for Emma. Without allowing himself time to reconsider, he walked over and placed the bowl into the stranger's trembling hands. "You look like you need this more than I do." The old man's eyes widened. "But what about you?" Thomas smiled gently. "I still have bread at home." The old man whispered a quiet blessing as tears filled his eyes. Thomas walked away carrying only the loaf. He never noticed the black carriage parked across the street or the elegant woman watching everything from inside. Margaret Whitmore had spent most of her 52 years surrounded by wealth, yet she had rarely witnessed genuine generosity. Since inheriting her late husband's successful grain company, people constantly tried to impress her, flatter her, or earn her favor. Few realized she could see through every performance. But the young father who had just given away his own meal expected nothing in return. He simply disappeared into the crowd before anyone could thank him. Margaret quietly instructed her driver to follow him from a distance. The carriage stopped outside Thomas's small farmhouse. She watched him enter carrying only bread. A few minutes later, laughter drifted through the open kitchen window. Curious, Margaret stepped closer. Inside she saw Thomas pretending the bread was part of a grand feast. Emma giggled as he dramatically bowed before placing the loaf on the table. "My lady," he announced with exaggerated elegance, "today the finest bakery in the county has prepared a royal banquet." Emma laughed so hard she nearly fell from her chair. "And what's for dessert?" she asked. Thomas grinned. "The chef recommends imagination." Emma closed her eyes. "I imagine apple pie." "So do I." They both laughed together before sharing the bread as though it were the greatest meal in the world. Margaret quietly wiped away a tear. For the first time since losing her husband, she felt something stir inside her heart. The following morning someone knocked on Thomas's door. He opened it to find an elegantly dressed woman standing beside a carriage. "Mr. Hale." "Yes. My name is Margaret Whitmore." Thomas recognized the name immediately. Everyone in the county knew the wealthy widow whose businesses employed hundreds of families. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all. I'd like to offer you a job. Thomas blinked. A job? I need someone to oversee repairs and maintenance at my estate. I appreciate the offer, ma'am, but I can't leave Emma alone all day. Margaret smiled. I expected you to say that. She looked toward Emma, who stood shyly behind the doorway. My estate has a small schoolhouse and several families living there. Emma would always have company. Thomas hesitated. It sounds too generous. Perhaps. I don't understand. You will. After discussing the details, Thomas accepted. The estate was unlike anything Emma had ever imagined. Flower gardens stretched around a beautiful stone mansion. Horses grazed peacefully beyond white fences. Workers greeted one another with respect instead of fear. Margaret knew every employee by name and often shared meals with them. Emma quickly befriended the children who lived nearby, while Thomas discovered that the estate desperately needed someone with his practical skills. Within weeks, broken fences had been repaired, leaking roofs replaced, and neglected gardens restored. Margaret noticed something else. Whenever Thomas finished his own work, he quietly helped everyone else without being asked. One evening she found him teaching a stable boy how to repair a broken wheel. You've already finished for the day, Margaret observed. Thomas shrugged. He was struggling. So you stayed. He reminds me of myself. Margaret smiled thoughtfully. Months passed. Emma began calling the estate home. For the first time since Sarah's death, Thomas laughed without forcing himself. Yet Margaret often watched father and daughter from the mansion window with an expression no one could quite understand. Her own daughter, Lily, had lost her father when she was only 5. Now 10 years old, Lily had grown into a quiet child who rarely smiled. She attended the best schools, owned every toy imaginable, and wore beautiful dresses, yet loneliness followed her everywhere. Money had given Margaret comfort. It had never replaced a father. One rainy afternoon, Lily wandered into the stable where Thomas was repairing a saddle. What are you making? She asked. Nothing exciting. It looks exciting. Thomas laughed. Come here. Carefully, he showed her how leather straps were stitched together. Lily listened with complete fascination. By sunset she had asked nearly 50 questions. The next day she returned. And the day after that. Soon it became routine. Thomas taught her to ride horses, identify birds by their songs, plant vegetables, and repair simple tools. He never treated her like a wealthy heiress. He treated her like a curious child. Something Margaret had prayed for quietly began to happen. Lily smiled again. One evening Margaret overheard Lily speaking with Emma beneath the old oak tree. I wish your father were my father too. Emma looked thoughtful. You can borrow him. Lily laughed. Can people do that? My papa says hearts don't run out of room. Margaret stood hidden behind the porch, unable to hold back tears. Several weeks later the annual Christmas festival arrived. The estate hosted families from neighboring farms. Music echoed across the grounds. Children built snowmen while lanterns illuminated every pathway. As the celebration ended, Margaret invited Thomas to the library. She seemed unusually nervous. I've been wanting to ask you something. Thomas waited patiently. She looked toward a framed portrait of her late husband. When Henry died, Lily stopped believing she would ever have a father again. Thomas nodded quietly. I understand. Margaret turned toward him. I've watched the way you care for every child on this estate. She paused, gathering her courage. Then, with tears shining in her eyes, she said softly, Thomas, be my daughter's father. Thomas stood completely still. For several long moments, the only sound in the library was the crackling of the fire. He looked at Margaret, unsure whether he had heard her correctly. I don't mean to replace Henry, she said quietly. No one ever could. And I know no one could ever replace Sarah in your heart. But I've watched Lily come alive again because of you. She laughs. She dreams. She smiles. She hasn't done that in years. Thomas lowered his eyes. I care about Lily very much. I know. But becoming her father. Margaret's voice trembled. I'm not asking for an answer tonight. I'm only asking you to think about what kind of family we might become. That night Thomas barely slept. After Emma had fallen asleep, he sat alone on the porch, staring at the stars. He thought about Sarah and the promises he had made to her. He remembered the lonely years after her death and the constant fear that he would never be enough for Emma. Then he thought about Lily's laughter, Margaret's kindness, and the peaceful life they had slowly built at the estate. The following morning, Emma found him sitting outside. Papa. He smiled. Good morning, sweetheart. You've been thinking all night. Was I that obvious? She nodded. Is it about Mrs. Whitmore? Thomas looked surprised. How did you know? I saw her crying yesterday. He gently took Emma's hand. She asked me something very important. Emma listened carefully as he explained. When he finished, she remained silent for a moment before asking, Do you love Mrs. Whitmore? Thomas hadn't expected such a direct question. I respect her. That's not what I asked. He smiled. No. Emma tilted her head. Not yet. Thomas laughed softly. Maybe. Not yet. Emma squeezed his hand. Then give your heart time. Children, he realized, often understood life better than adults. Over the next few weeks, nothing changed on the surface. Thomas continued his work, Margaret continued managing the estate, and the children played together every afternoon. But beneath the ordinary routines, something new quietly grew. Margaret no longer carried every burden alone. When difficult decisions arose, Thomas offered calm advice instead of judgment. When Thomas worried about Emma's future, Margaret reminded him that no child should carry the weight of a parent's fears. They became partners long before either of them realized it. One afternoon a fierce storm swept across the valley. Heavy winds tore branches from trees and damaged several cottages belonging to estate workers. Without hesitation, Thomas gathered volunteers. For 2 straight days he repaired roofs, rescued frightened animals, and made sure every family had food and blankets before returning to his own house. Late on the second evening, Margaret found him sitting on the porch, exhausted. You haven't rested. They needed help. So did you. She placed a warm cup of tea into his hands. You always take care of everyone else. Thomas looked at her. So do you. For the first time, neither of them looked away. Spring arrived with fields of wildflowers stretching across the countryside. The estate held its annual planting celebration, inviting every family in the county. As music filled the air, Lily climbed onto the small stage. I want to say something. The crowd laughed warmly. Lily looked directly at Thomas. When my daddy died, I thought I would never have another one. Then God sent Mr. Thomas. The crowd became silent. She climbed down from the stage, ran across the grass, and threw her arms around him. You already are my father in my heart. Many people quietly wiped away tears. Thomas knelt and hugged her tightly. I'll always be here for you. Margaret watched the scene through tear-filled eyes. That evening Thomas walked to the garden where Margaret often sat after sunset. She looked up as he approached. I've made my decision. She stood slowly. I don't know what the future will bring, he said. Life has taught me that nothing is guaranteed. But I do know this. I don't want to face the future without you, Lily and Emma. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. He gently took her hands. If you'll still have me, I'd be honored to become Lily's father. Before he could finish another word, Margaret embraced him. Months later, beneath a canopy of blooming apple trees, they were married in a simple ceremony surrounded by friends, neighbors, and every family who lived on the estate. Emma walked proudly beside her father. Lily carried a basket of white flowers. When the minister declared them husband and wife, the two girls looked at each other, laughed, and hugged before anyone else could move. "We're sisters now," Emma exclaimed. The guests burst into applause. Life afterward wasn't perfect, but it was full. Thomas never tried to replace Henry, and Margaret never tried to replace Sarah. Instead, they honored the memories of those they had loved while building something new together. Emma and Lily grew up side by side, sharing birthdays, secrets, school lessons, and dreams. Anyone meeting them assumed they had been sisters since birth. Years later, Thomas and Margaret opened a community kitchen on the edge of the estate. Every evening, anyone who was hungry could eat there without paying a single coin. Above the entrance hung a simple wooden sign. "No one leaves hungry." One snowy evening, an elderly traveler stopped by for supper. As Thomas handed him a steaming bowl of vegetable soup, the old man stared at him in amazement. "Do you remember me?" he asked. Thomas looked closely. The years had changed the man's face, but then he recognized him. You're the gentleman from the town square." The old man smiled. "The one who received your last meal." Thomas laughed in disbelief. "I never expected to see you again." "I never forgot your kindness," the man replied. "That bowl of soup gave me enough strength to reach my daughter's home. She had been searching for me for weeks. Because of you, I lived to meet my grandchildren." Tears filled Thomas's eyes. "I only did what anyone should have done." The old man shook his head. "No. Many people walked past me that day. You stopped." Margaret, Emma, and Lily listened quietly. The old man looked around the bustling kitchen where volunteers served meals to dozens of families. One act of kindness became all of this. Thomas smiled. "It wasn't just me." He looked at Margaret. "It began with a hungry man." She looked back at him. "And a father willing to give away his last meal." As the evening came to an end, children laughed around the fireplace while neighbors shared stories over warm bread and soup. Thomas glanced at his family. Emma was helping younger children set the tables. Lily was reading a story to a group gathered near the fire. Margaret stood beside him, her hand resting gently in his. Years ago, he had walked home carrying only a loaf of bread, believing he had nothing left to give. He had no idea that the meal he gave away would return to him as a home filled with love, two daughters who adored each other, a wife who became his greatest companion, and a family stronger than he had ever dared to imagine. Sometimes the smallest sacrifice becomes the beginning of life's greatest blessing, and Thomas knew that true wealth had never been measured by the money in a person's pocket, but by the kindness in their heart and the love they chose to share with others.